Hello everyone. This is sort of a last minute video. So there was some confusion about how writing a philosophy paper is going to work. So this is another video to hopefully help you guys out. Okay, so in this video I'm going to be working through the process of writing a philosophy paper using one of the arguments that we considered in class and using an actual example about how I want the paper to go. So my hope is that this will clarify the situation for you if you're still confused. If not, of course, feel free to reach out to me and we can try to figure out another way to make it clear. But this is my approach for right now. And as I was saying, I hope that this helps if you're confused about how to write a philosophy paper. Okay, so the argument we're going to start with is probably everybody's favorite, perhaps one of the weirdest and most confusing arguments from the class, the ontological argument. Okay, so I'm going to run through the premises. God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. All right, I'm sure we all remember this. When we understand something, that thing exists in our understanding. So, God is that than which nothing greater can be thought exists in our understanding. This follows from the first two premises. But if God really is that than which nothing greater can be thought, then God must not only exist in our understanding, but he must also exist in reality. Because if he didn't also exist in reality, there would be something greater, namely that being that existed both in our understanding and in reality. And this would be a contradiction. So, God exists both in our understanding and in reality. Okay, we've been through this one a few times. It's the ontological argument. Okay, now, what am I asking you to do in the paper? So, I'm asking you to begin by putting an argument like this one, whether you choose the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, or the teleological argument, one of those three, and put it into your own words. And this is one of the assignments, is the part of putting the argument into your own words. So do that first. Then I asked you to object. So there's two ways to object to an argument. The first way is that you can argue that one of the premises is false, right? And when you do this, you also need to explain why the premise is false and what effect this is going to have on the argument, but I'll say a little bit about this later. The other way that you can object to an argument is that you can argue that even if the premises were true, that the conclusion doesn't properly follow from the premises. Now notice that the second option is objecting to the form of the argument, right? So it's saying that the premises don't fit together in the right way to make the conclusion true. Now, this is importantly not the same thing as disagreeing with the conclusion. Actually, it's not a way to object to an argument to just disagree with the conclusion, right? So if we go back and look at our ontological argument, right, the conclusion is that God exists both in our understanding and in reality. Right. Now, I can't just object to that conclusion. That doesn't make any sense. I actually have to object to one of the premises. Okay? Now, here's our ontological argument again. And I've highlighted in black there the premise that I'm going to object to. The first premise, that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, how do we go about objecting to this premise? Okay, well, maybe we remember our good friend Aquinas. Perhaps not everyone who hears the word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body, right? So what Aquinas is saying here is that there's other ways to understand the word God other than that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay. So this is a way to object to that first premise, that God means that than which nothing greater can be thought. What Aquinas is saying here is that, hey, that doesn't have to be true. Some people think about God as a body. Okay. So what is the effect of this objection on the argument? Okay. Here's the argument, as we recall. So what happens if we replace that first premise with God as a body? right? Well, what we really quickly discover is that the whole argument doesn't work anymore, right? Because if we remember how the argument works, it was God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. So it's the that God being nothing greater than can be thought that's doing the work later in the argument in the fourth premise, right? So it's because of that characteristic of God being greater than can be thought that allows God to have to exist in both our understanding and in reality. Okay? So, if we can successfully argue that rather than that than which nothing greater can be thought, we should understand God as a body, then the argument doesn't work anymore. Okay? So that is the effect of the objection, right? So, the argument doesn't work anymore because it was God as that than which nothing greater could be thought that was making the argument work. Once we remove this understanding of God, the argument falls apart. It just doesn't work anymore. The fourth premise doesn't make any sense. Okay? Great. The next part of your objection. What reasons do we have for making this objection? Right? So I could say, God is a lollipop, right? But I need to have reasons for believing that, right? It's not really an objection just to say, I want to replace this premise with something absurd, right? You need a reason that the premise is false. So in this case, a reason why understanding God as that than which nothing greater can be thought is false, and instead we should think of God as a body. So what reasons do we have for thinking this? Why do we need to understand God as that than which nothing greater can be thought, right? This can be one reason. So why do we need to think of God that way? Perhaps this seems natural to us, right? But maybe if we think about it a little bit more, we might recognize that there are other ways to think about God, right? So we can start to make the case for this objection that thinking of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought doesn't make any sense. In addition, right, so we saw Aquinas said that some people think of God as a body. What reasons do they have for accepting God as a body, right? And so I mixed up my 2 points here. So this, what I was just talking about is this last one. What reasons do we have for the people who thought of God as a body? What reasons did they have for holding the view? Okay. So this is sort of a list of reasons that you can attach to the objection that we can think of God as a body rather than that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay. So where are we in the process so far? Well, we started with the argument, right? The ontological argument. So you'd put that into your own words. Then we objected, and we objected to the first premise, right? The first premise said that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay, so our objection was, well, why do we have to understand that God that way? Why can't we understand God as a body? Okay, so the next step is to move on to the reply, right? So maybe we like the ontological argument and we don't like the objection that we can think of, why do we have to think of God that way? Why can't we think of God as a body, right? So what you want to ask yourself is, how might someone who agrees with the ontological argument respond to someone who's objecting to this argument by holding that God is a body, right? Okay, so here's one reason. If God's a body, it seems like God loses all of the characteristics that we associate with God, right? So this is a reason to object, or to a way to reply to the objection, right? And in addition, if God has these characteristics, right? So the characteristic of greatness, all-knowingness, so on and so forth, but is also a body, right? Then look, that doesn't actually affect the argument at all. So you can replace God as a body with the first premise, and if that body is also that than which nothing greater can be thought, yeah, that doesn't actually change anything, right? But the way you can reply to this objection is to say, look, if we think of God as a body, it seems like that understanding of God has lost all of the characteristics that we think are important about God, okay? So just to sort of review where we're at, okay, so we've looked at our argument, the ontological argument, and then our objection. Why can't God be a body, right? Or another way we can think of the objection is, do we have to think of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought? Okay? And then the response to that objection. Well, God seems to have characteristics that make the view of God as a body not make any sense. Okay? All right. Now we are moving on to the reply to the response. Okay. So the reply to the response. Okay. Here, there's two ways that you can go. If you think that your original objection is good, you need to find a way to reply to this response to the objection. If you're successful in replying to the response to the objection, then the argument fails. Okay? So in this circumstance, you need to ask yourself, why doesn't the response that I just gave to the objection, why doesn't it work? Okay? The other alternative is to say, look, if you actually don't think that the objection is any good, then instead you need to explain why the response to the objection doesn't leave any room for the objection to work. Okay? So in this case, you want to ask yourself, well, why doesn't this response to the objection work, right? What's wrong with this response? And then also, what does this tell us about the argument? Because remember, in this case, you've defended the argument from the objection. Okay? And now I'm going to actually walk through both of these options. Okay, so with our argument, with our objection to the ontological argument, right? And we'll remember that the response was to say, well, look, if we take away all of those characteristics, right? The characteristics of God being that than which nothing greater can be thought, it doesn't seem like we have what we think of as God left. Okay? Now, what happens if I think that that objection is a good objection? So I want to reply to the response. Okay, here's one way I could do it. I could say, there's nothing that requires God to have the characteristics of being greater than anything else that can be conceived, right? So how this kind of works, right, is I could say that, like, look, God could be the most powerful thing I could conceive of, right? We're all powerful, but either of these things is not greater than I can conceive, right? And without thinking of God as something than which nothing greater can be conceived, or God being greater than I can conceive, then the ontological argument doesn't work, right? So this response is saying, look, God can still be like pretty great. He just isn't greater than I can conceive, right? And as long as he isn't greater than I can conceive, then the ontological argument doesn't work. To sort of press on this point, maybe all we need is to say, look, it's actually just logically possible for me to imagine God in this alternative way, right? So if this is the position that I'm holding, that it's like, look, all I'm trying to do is show that we don't know for sure that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived, then we would put the person making the ontological argument in the situation where they would have to give us an additional argument for why we need to imagine God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay? All right. Now the other side. What if I think that the objection is bad and I want the argument, the ontological argument, to stand? Okay, in this case, what I want to say is that, look, the whole purpose of God is for him to be more powerful than anything that we can imagine, anything that we can conceive, anything that we can think, right? And if God doesn't have this characteristic of being greater than anything else I can think of, then it doesn't really seem to be doing the work of God, right? Or, as I was saying in the previous slide here, I could give an argument for why we actually have to understand God as that than which nothing greater can be thought. Okay? So here's a shot at that, right? So I think that for God to function as God, not only is his greatness required, right, but in addition, we're required to have more greatness than we as humans can possibly understand, right? Because you would imagine that if we're talking about God, his level of greatness would be greater than we can conceive. This seems to be the only thing that makes sense, right? So this is a way to carry on with the response to the objection, right? In this case, where we want the argument to stand. Okay? So where are we? What have we covered? So I started with the ontological argument, right? And then I presented an objection to it. Now remember, when you're objecting to an argument, you have to choose one of the premises that you don't like and then explain what's wrong with the premise, right? Okay, so which I did. I responded to the, my objection was aimed at the first premise, and I was wondering why we can't understand God as a body. Then I wanted you to respond to your objection, right? So this is explaining why the objection doesn't work, what's wrong with the objection. And so what I said is that, look, it doesn't make sense to think of God as a body because it doesn't seem to make sense to think of God without the characteristics of being great, right? And then I'm asking you to reply to this response. So there were two ways to do this. One way was if you think that the objection is good and the argument fails. Okay, so the example here I gave was that, look, nothing requires God to be that than which nothing greater can be thought. We can imagine God in all kinds of other ways. And then the other reply, this is in the case where the objection is bad and the argument stands, right? And what I said there was, look, we can't possibly comprehend God's greatness. So I hope that this clarified things. I'm not sure if it will. If it doesn't, please reach out to me and I will try to further clarify. But this was an overview of how I want you to write your philosophy paper using actual examples from the class. So, thank you.